So today we are talking about young adulthood. This is a pretty long time span that we're talking about here. So it goes basically from the end of adolescence, which we talked about last time. You know, some researchers say that's 18, some say 20, but somewhere around there, up until 40. So almost a 20-year span of development that we're talking about here. I kind of wish I could find a textbook that would divide it up even further. I feel like the stuff that's happening from like 18 to 30 is a little different from 30 to 40, but they just lump it all together for whatever reason. So that's the time span we're talking about today. As usual, we'll start with physical and cognitive, and then we'll get into social and emotional development. So one of the kind of trends you'll see for the rest of the quarter is that up until now, we've been talking lots about like growth and improvement and everything getting better. And once you get into young adulthood, things start to kind of plateau, and then eventually they start to decline. And then especially as we get into late adulthood, like next week or whenever that'll be, we'll talk a lot more about decline, which can be a little bit of a downer. I sometimes wish I could like teach this class in reverse or something so that we don't end, we end with death in this class. So about as down as we can get at the end of the quarter. But it is, yeah, it's like there's nothing I can do about it to change the order of the class in any way that would make sense anyway. So, yep. Yeah, basically. So that mostly applies to physical growth in young adulthood, that we see this plateau and then decline. We do see that cognitive abilities, for the most part, are still continuing to improve. We've got some more development of the prefrontal cortex going on. We've got life experiences contributing to that. We'll talk a little bit about, this transition from school into establishing a career. That's kind of the highest priority in young adulthood. So those are the topics we're going to focus on first. So like I said, in terms of physical changes, we start to see a lot of declines, especially, as we get into the later part of young adulthood. I would say we still see some improvements up until, maybe like 25 or 30 or so, and then you start to plateau and see some declines towards the end of this stage. And those declines are pretty universal. They happen in a lot of different organs and organ systems throughout the body, and they can be influenced by both genetics and lifestyle. So life expectancy overall, as you guys may know, has improved pretty drastically over the past, couple centuries due to improved nutrition, advances in medicine, etc. So we tend to live a lot longer, and this decline tends to happen a little bit later compared to what it did previously. What drives aging is kind of a combination of factors. So there are some programmed effects that is due to genetics. So this would be, we talked about this a little bit with the brain, that idea of like apoptosis, where some of your cells are actually programmed to die eventually. That's just like in their genes. And we see that throughout the body. There's kind of like this programmed, predetermined pathway that your cells are going to go down, that inevitably they're just going to start to accrue damage and eventually die. Another thing that's happening in the genes, so if you think about like DNA, so remember back to your biology classes, you've got like this double-stranded helix or whatever. And at the end of the strands of the DNA, there's something called telomeres, which are basically like caps on the DNA that's kind of just, it's like useless strands of the segments of DNA or whatever. So they don't really code for anything, but they're there because every single time that your cells divide and this DNA is sort of being broken down and then reassembled over and over again, every time that process happens, the ends of your DNA get like shortened a tiny bit. It's like just this, it's just part of the mechanism of how DNA replicates, that this is just going to slowly get cut off every time it copies and replicates. And so we call that little useless bit at the end that's getting cut off over time as a telomere. And so as you're aging, your cells are dividing, those telomeres are getting shorter and shorter and shorter, and eventually they disappear completely. And then we start getting into functional DNA. That's now every time that cell replicates, it's going to cut off a little bit of that functional piece of DNA, which is going to cause these mutations, which is going to make your cells start to accrue damage. That might lead to things like cancer, or it might just make it to where the cell doesn't divide properly. And so those kinds of genetic issues start to pile up as you get older, and that's part of what leads to aging, to biological aging, like the physical effects that we see throughout the body. Certain unhealthy behaviors can actually increase the rate of the telomere shortening. So it's been shown that things like smoking cigarettes, for example, drinking large amounts of alcohol, if you have a really sedentary lifestyle, those things that we typically think of as unhealthy, part of the reason they're unhealthy is because they speed up that process of the telomere shortening. There's also kind of random environmental events, so exposure to toxins. There's, like free radicals, basically like bits of oxygen that aren't attached to anything, that can interact with the DNA in the cell as well and kind of break apart the telomeres and other parts of the DNA. And just the older you get, the more you experience those random events that are completely outside of your control. And again, they just sort of pile up and lead to this aging over time. Yeah.
Aging was like a big part of my last job as an esthetician, so I just find the whole process really interesting, and I would always recommend to my clients to like start taking supplements,
right,
instead of like relying on these like $200 facial cleansers, which are really great, but not everyone can afford a $200 cleanser.
Right.
So I kept telling them like go to Amazon and get some like saw palmetto and things like that. And I learned about I think it's like DHA or something. I don't remember. It's like a something that the body produced that like sped up the aging process. Like for women, it broke down collagen in the skin,
right,
and blocked like the production of natural collagen. For men, it like causes hair loss and stuff. So I was always telling everyone, take saw palmetto. It's really gonna help you the most. I find that part really interesting.
Yeah, and there's obviously a ton of research into figuring out like how can we stop this process or slow it down. I've seen all kinds of studies in the past that are mostly with mice where they find something that like stops this process, but then it never translates to humans. So it's kind of, and then I also always wonder, like, should we? It's kind of the Jurassic Park, like just because we can, does that mean we should?
Like all the carbon, like see what happens when powerful people live too long.
I mean, already we're at a point where like people are living to such a long age, they can be, in positions of power for way longer, which then often has detrimental effects on younger generations. So it's kind of like, I completely understand the impulse to want to preserve life for as long as possible, but at some point, it's like, well, what about the younger generations, and what are, how are they going to deal with that? So.
Let's be honest, no one wants to live forever. Like, I don't talk about it, but like, no, you don't.
I think it would definitely.
That's true. My great grandmother, when she passed at 94, she was like, please let me go. I don't want to do it. I'm 94. I'm done.
Yeah, agreed. I was just looking at my slides to see. I have lots of notes, and I couldn't remember if it was for a later slide or for now. So I'll just talk about it now, and then if it's on a slide, then I'll just say, oh, I already said that. It'll be fine. So we've got these cellular sort of like DNA level genetic effects going on. And then at the systems level, there's also something called cross-linkage issues. So if you think about all the tissues in your body and how they're sort of connected, when you're young, those connections tend to be very like elastic and malleable. So all the tissues like your lungs and your heart and everything has some flexibility to it. As we get older, partially due to these genetic effects and other things that are going on, all those tissues start to stiffen up, which can make them just way less efficient. So you can imagine, like, if your heart starts to stiffen, it's not going to pump as effectively. If your lungs start to stiffen, it's going to be harder to expand and contract and breathe. And so that like stiffening of those cross linkages that hold all the tissues together can also sort of cause damage and issues as we get older.
What did you say that's called?
Cross linkage. Yeah, it's called cross linkage theory, but yeah. So both the genetic and those more like tissue level effects accumulate, and they cause declines in all kinds of systems. So pretty much everything I have listed here. So in the cardiovascular system, as we get into this like end of young adulthood, again, like probably around 30-ish is when you start to see declines in these systems. For cardiovascular system, the main thing we see in young adulthood is that whenever you're doing strenuous activity in particular, the cardiovascular system has a hard time keeping up with that. So someone who's just at rest in young adulthood, their heart is going to be functioning about the same as like adolescence or previously. but it's when you switch over to doing like exercise or something really strenuous, or you're in a high stress state, then the cardiovascular system has a harder time keeping up with those kind of higher levels of performance. So you have reduced performance under stress. Also, in young adulthood, you tend to accumulate like hypertension, so high blood pressure. Again, that might be due to the lack of elasticity, like the vessels are having a harder time contracting and expanding the way that they're supposed to. There can also be buildup of fatty tissues throughout the veins and the arteries, which makes it harder for the heart to pump blood through. You can have blockages and things like that. So that's the cardiovascular system, pumping the blood through the body. So yeah, if there's like a blockage of fatty stuff in the veins, then it's harder for the blood to make its way through there. We also see declines in the respiratory system, kind of like I was saying before. So because the lungs become stiffer, it's harder for them to expand, and especially, again, to adapt whenever we're doing really strenuous activity. So the maximum volume of air that can make its way into the lungs decreases as we get into young adulthood. So motor performance, again, kind of like the others, tends to peak around between like the ages of 20 to 35, particularly for those who remain athletic into young adulthood. But around like 30 to 35 is where we start to see declines in motor performance. So that would be things like, running, jumping, all those gross motor skills in particular that we've talked about before. We also see, so the immune system is a little bit tricky. There's kind of this you see an increase in adaptive immunity. So adaptive immunity is like when you're exposed to the flu or COVID and your body learns how to react to that. So as you get older and you've been exposed to more of those pathogens, you're building up that adaptive immunity. So your adaptive immunity actually strengthens through young adulthood. But the other part, there's another part of your immune system called the innate immune system. That's kind of just like your general inflammatory response. Like if you think of any time you cut yourself or something like that, get a bruise, and it swells up and you've got maybe some like itching and redness, like that inflammatory response is the innate immune system. And that tends to actually weaken as we get older. So it's like part of our immune system is degrading and declining, part of it is strengthening. Stress contributes a lot to that. So the more chronic stress that you experience, the more declines you see in that innate immune response. And then we also tend to see declines in the reproductive system as well. For women in particular, once you get to around 35, I'd say between like 35 and 40, right at the tail end of this young adulthood phase, there's a pretty drastic decline in fertility. So that happens in kind of a number of ways. So first you have a reduced number of eggs available. So I think we've mentioned this before, but like you're basically born, for women, you're born with a number of eggs that you're going to have for the rest of your life. And then obviously you're releasing at least one every single month. And so as you get up in age, like the number of eggs you have left is obviously going to be less than when you were younger. And the quality of those eggs is often also going to be less. So at 35, the chance of having like birth defects or miscarriages, things like that, goes up pretty drastically. Again, that's something though that's changing with medical technology. So this might have changed since I last checked, but the last I knew, the oldest person to have a baby was 74 years old. I remember hearing fairly recently in the news that someone had broken that record though, so it's probably even older than that. So there's a woman in southern India. She got pregnant through IVF, and then the child was born through C-section, and she actually gave birth to twins. And as far as I know, they didn't have any like major defects or anything like that. So it is possible to still have healthy children up until a really pretty high age for women, but it's much less, just statistically, much less likely that the baby's going to be healthy or that it's going to be a successful pregnancy.
Was that one of the cases where she's like a surrogate? Because I've read stories of like the grandma.
It might have been. Yeah.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, it makes more sense if it's not your egg. Obviously, you've just gone through menopause.
Right. And I mean,
Factory still works.
right. And since it was through IVF, that would make sense that, yeah, it might have been someone else's eggs. I don't know. So women's reproductive health peaks around age 20 and then starts to decline from there. And like I said, at about 35 to 40 is when you see the most drastic decline. Let's see. So for men, it's a little less drastic and it tends to happen later. So men start to see some decline also around like 35 to 40, but just the rate of that decline is much more gradual and much less extreme or drastic. And essentially what we see with men is that the volume of sperm tends to decrease. So kind of like with women have less eggs, men also have less sperm. And then similarly, the quality of those sperm also decreases. They tend to have less motility, so it's like harder for them to swim around, basically. So yeah, even men have issues with fertility as they get older as well. Yeah.
Sorry. My father was really old when I was born. He was like 59.
Yeah.
And he was born in the South during the Great Depression. He was born in like 31. And he used to tell me all the time, oh, I read stories about when there's a big age gap between the mom and the dad, the kids have a higher chance of having a greater IQ and all these things. My mother was very young. She was like 25 when I was born. And I was like, yeah, even at 13, I was like, I'm pretty sure that's bullshit.
Yeah, I've never heard that ever. And that doesn't seem to check out from what I've... Yeah. Yeah. Yep. So declines overall. Pretty much every system in the body is experiencing some declines. Now, a lot of this, though, is based on experience. I should also say, too, let me back up and really quickly point out that a lot of the studies that show these drastic declines are cross-sectional studies. So if you remember way back to like week 1 when we talked about research, we talked about the difference between cross-sectional and longitudinal. So cross-sectional would be like if right now I went, I'm interested in the cardiovascular system and I took, a bunch of you in your 20s and some people in their 30s and some people in their 40s, and I looked at their cardiovascular health, right now. That would be cross-sectional. Whereas longitudinal would be if I looked at your cardiovascular health right now and then tracked you for the next like 20 years or whatever. And so most of the studies that show these drastic declines are cross-sectional. And so some of these effects might not actually be due to aging, but they might be more like generational differences. So generations previous to us would have had less access to medical technology that we have now. Their nutrition might have been worse. So the declines that they're experiencing might be worse than what you will experience. Hopefully that makes sense. So,
what about men, like testosterone production? Does that start to decline like later on than women, or?
I don't know about the age. I would guess the age is about the same as far as when it starts to decline, but it's more gradual for men, whereas women, it's like this steep drop off, basically. So, like with what we'll talk about menopause and stuff in late adulthood, because that usually happens right around 40 or, between 40 and 50. And yeah, for women, it's like this kind of obvious drastic change where we like put a label on it. Even we call it menopause. For men, we don't really have a similar term because it's so much more gradual of a change. So I might have thought I had stuff about hormones in here, but I'm probably thinking of later adulthood.
People that I know personally who have to go on like hormone replacement therapy.
Right.
Like men who have to start taking testosterone.
Yeah.
I find that really interesting. I don't know if that's like different than what men were experiencing in the previous generations. Or
right.
It's like now we're noticing it kind of thing.
Yeah, I would bet it's partially noticing it and having conversations about it, and men being maybe more open to like admit like, oh, my testosterone levels are low and I need to like seek help or whatever. Because in the past they probably would have been very aversive to admitting to something like that. So
levels were way higher back in the day.
Yeah.
They pushed the normal range like down to I think it's like 3. You don't get like prescribed testosterone unless you're like below 300. Where back in the day it was like 5.
right.
Studies saying that like they project like in the next 7 to 10 years, men might need help conceiving, like not being able to do it on their own.
Yeah.
And they think some of it could be like how much plastic we kind of ingest,
right.
Like that lowers your body's natural system.
Yeah, I could see that. Yeah.
That's interesting. I've known a lot of dudes who have to be on testosterone, and theirs was like really like 100.
Right.
really low, and
Yeah.
their lives are just miserable. It's great to see that they do have access to it, and then like they can get their lives back.
Yeah.
Much.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. I need to look into more of that. I'm pretty sure we talk about more about hormone stuff in later adulthood. So, all right. So yeah, and a lot of this is also due to experience. So keep in mind the whole cross-sectional versus longitudinal thing. Maybe it's not going to be as bad as we sometimes anticipate. But then there's also tons of research, as you guys probably know, that if you just use some preventative techniques, then the decline is going to happen later, and it's going to be a lot less drastic, and you're going to preserve some of those physical, attributes for much longer than you otherwise would. So some of the best things you can do, having a healthy diet. Probably the most consistently healthy diet that a place like the World Health Organization recommends is the Mediterranean diet, which is essentially a diet that's really high in fruits and vegetables, really low in like red meats and sugary processed foods. So typically they tend to eat meats that are going to be like fish, seafood, maybe like chicken, like really lean meats. Any fats in their diet are going to come from like olive oil, things that are, the sort of healthier fats. So that tends to be the most recommended diet that will help stave off a lot of those physical declines that we talked about. In addition to that, exercising regularly. It's recommended to get like 150 minutes a week of cardiovascular exercise of moderate intensity. So that could be, like running or doing Pilates or, anything that's getting your heart rate up, basically. So that's 150 minutes per week of that. And then at least 2 sessions of some sort of resistance exercise. So that would be like lifting weights, for example. That's kind of, again, the recommendation from places like the World Health Organization. So, not surprisingly, if someone is not dieting or exercising, if they're overweight or obese, then they're much more likely to experience a lot of those declines we talked about much earlier. There's also all kinds of mental health benefits to having regular diet and exercise. It improves happiness, decreases depression and anxiety, etc. In addition to all of that, sleep hygiene is really important. Have you guys heard the phrase sleep hygiene?
I think I've heard it in passing.
I said it in another class and everyone looked at me like I was crazy, like they had never heard that phrase. Since I don't know if it's like a regional thing, like the Midwest uses it a lot and you guys don't hear, or if it's, I don't know what it is, but I've heard it.
Your sheets.
No. So sleep hygiene is like developing good habits to have a sort of a routine before bedtime and your wake up time, etc. So some of the things that are recommended to do, number 1 is going to sleep and waking up at the same time every day, even on the weekends. I'm terrible at this. I always try to get a couple extra hours of sleep on the weekends, but that's what's recommended. Cutting off screens for at least a couple of hours before you go to sleep. So one of the worst things that you can do is sit there in bed with a phone right in front of your face, shining bright light into your eyes. It's just not good for your circadian rhythm. That's the one I have conquered. I used to be really bad at just staring at my phone until late at night, and now I'm like, no, I put it away like an hour or 2 before bed. I also put it away from my bed. So, I have my charger set up on like a desk on the other side of the room, so I'm not tempted to look at it. What else? Go ahead.
The shit posting groups are just so funny. I can't get out of it.
Yes, and there's a phenomenon I've been hearing about called, what is it? It's like, oh my gosh, revenge procrastination or something like that. Have you guys heard this phrase? It's been coming out. It's like the idea that throughout the whole day, everyone's so busy with work and everything else, and everybody wants to be on our phones just checking stuff, but we can't. And so then at night, it's like you're almost getting revenge on the day of just sitting up and doing all the scrolling you wish you could have been doing. Yeah.
I'm like, I get this is my phone time, and it's I'm keeping myself awake. I'll fall asleep, and I'm like, oh, I gotta keep why?
Yeah.
Why do you do that to yourself?
Yeah.
It's like a revenge sleep cycle.
Yes.
What I was told, because I had that in middle school and all that, where it's you guys took my whole day, so now I'm staying up all night.
Yeah.
It's
Yes.
But it was not on purpose.
Mm-hmm.
It sucks.
Plus your sleep cycle is so different, in middle school and high school too. So it's
Yeah.
this just feels natural.
Yep. Yeah. So that's bad. Don't do that. Put your phone away. Having some sort of routine that you follow. It doesn't have to be something specific, but every night if you wash your face and then brush your teeth and then like put on a little diffuser and like read a book or whatever. Like if that's your routine, stick to that every night. Kind of trains your brain like this is sleepy time, I'm getting into sleepy time, and then I'm going to go to sleep. Kind of associated with that, like having clothes that are very specific for sleeping and then not wearing those for other activities. So if like I love to wear sweatpants, every day that when I go home from work, like first thing I do is like change into comfortable pants. But I've made like a distinction. Like I have like my pajamas that are slightly different, and then I have more like sort of athleisure sweatpants for when I'm at home just relaxing, so that my brain knows like when I put on these pants, that's sleepy time, and these pants are like just leisure or whatever. So yes.
Did you see that meme during COVID when it was like you gotta like change out of the pajamas after you take a shower and then change into new pajamas and then like you change into like different pajamas at bedtime when you go to sleep.
Yep. I had my like meeting pajamas when I'm doing Zoom calls.
Like my ADHD, I do like things like that where it's like if I take off my shoes, I'm not gonna get anything done.
Yeah.
So like I have sweatpants I wear to bed and sweatpants I wear all the time.
Yes.
With a specific shirt, like my dad this summer he like made me cover up. Put this on, and so I ended up just kind of stealing it, and now he just has like the sleep in.
Yes.
I
Yeah.
wonder why the shoe thing is a thing, because my husband's the same way. Every time I ask him to do something, he's like, I don't have shoes on.
Yeah.
I'm like,
So, like,
get some shoes on.
If I sit down but in shoes, I can sit on the couch and do something with it. But he's on my shoes, so it's like.
Yeah. Then your
But
brain
you're not
knows.
getting anything.
Yes. Yeah.
So weird.
Yep. Our brain is very good at making those associations and like picking up patterns and then like sticking to those like a habit. So yeah. Again, I think I've mentioned this before too, but it's been shown that getting good sleep can help prevent things like Alzheimer's and dementia. So during sleep, our brain is like flushing all the waste materials and stuff that can build up if you're not getting proper sleep. That also gives our immune system time to fight off pathogens. It gives our body time to recover from stress. So it's super duper, extremely important. In addition to that, we're about to talk about cognitive changes in a little bit, but having some sort of cognitive enrichment, and this could come from a million different places. There's, all kinds of different ways you could get cognitive enrichment. Ideally, maybe having like a career or a job or something that's cognitively engaging so that you're doing that constantly every day for pretty much your whole life. But if you have a job that's pretty like menial and mindless, then trying to find hobbies that are cognitively engaging. So that could be, like learning new skills, learning a new language, playing certain like types of board games or puzzle games, just anything where you're using your mind in a new way. Ideally, maybe changing that up pretty frequently. So if you already play a bunch of board games and you feel like you're getting something out of that, maybe try adding something totally new and different into your hobbies to engage your brain in a different way. So just staying cognitively enriched, that can help stave off a lot of the cognitive declines that we're going to talk about. Not so much today because most of the cognitive declines happen more in later adulthood, but just while we're talking about preventing decline, I thought I'd include that here as well. Okay. So we talked about some of the declines and changes that are happening in most of the body, but we also need to talk a little bit about brain changes. For the most part, we're still seeing some kind of improvement and development in the brain and in cognition throughout young adulthood. So the brain's not quite going into decline yet. We continue to see, just like we've seen through all the other phases, continued pruning of synapses due to experience. And we finally, in this stage, we reach full development of the prefrontal cortex. So fairly early on in young adulthood, I'd say by like 25 to 26, you're going to have your prefrontal cortex fully myelinated. That's kind of the last step that has to happen. Like all the connections have been made, the cortex is kind of established, but then you're developing more myelin that wraps around those axons to speed up the processing of the prefrontal cortex. Yeah.
I've noticed this weird trend. It happened to me when I was 25, where everyone that I know hits 25 and then they have like a quarter life crisis where you realize like you're in a toxic downward spiral and you don't want to live like that anymore. Do you think like that could be related to the prefrontal cortex?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think probably up until 25, we're all making decisions based on a very like short-term reward kind of thing because we don't have the prefrontal cortex planning for us. And then, yeah, once those developments kick in, your brain is kind of like, oh, wait, whoa, like if I keep doing this in 10 years, I'm going to be in a really bad place. And so then you reverse and change course, hopefully, or some people go the opposite way and dig in deeper. It just kind of depends on. But
and then according to astrologists, at 27 is like when you have a Saturn return too. So that's like another time that people experience like the get your shit together kind of thing.
Right. Yeah. So you've got this prefrontal cortex that makes us a lot better at things like planning and goal setting and following through on those. Also much better at emotional regulation now, finally. We can stop throwing tantrums and deal with our problems in an effective way.
Sometimes.
Yeah, hopefully. And then all those other kind of executive functions we've talked about so many times, things like reasoning, making decisions, etc. So outside of the prefrontal cortex, the rest of the brain can also continue to develop, but that's very much based on experience. So, whatever parts of your brain you're using, those are going to be strengthened. And whichever parts you're not using, those are probably going to be pruned away and start to weaken. So if you're exercising a lot and you have good health habits, then not only is that strengthening the parts of your body we talked about previously, but it's also strengthening the parts of your brain that make those decisions. So every time you choose to do something healthy, your brain is learning that pathway. It's learning, I made a healthy choice. It's easier and easier now to make those healthy choices. If you play an instrument, then obviously like the musical parts of your brain are going to continue to develop. If you play board games and things like that, then those areas of the brain are going to continue to develop. So a lot of the other changes in the brain are very experience dependent. I would also say too, like the negative side, if you're the type of person who spends a lot of time worrying or, being very anxious or constantly thinking about like threats and things like that, then you're strengthening those parts of your brain, and it makes it then easier for your brain to keep, staying in those patterns of thought. So I'd say it's around this time, really at the age y'all are at is a good time to really like try to drill down and establish those healthy habits. The longer you wait, the harder it gets. So it gets so much harder when you get into your 30s. If you haven't established like good exercise and diet routines, it's so much more difficult to like put those into place as you get older. So
I personally felt like some of those things were a lot easier because I felt more rational as I got older, And
right.
I had like more of the long-term goal concept
Yeah.
than I did when I was younger.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm saying it's easier at the beginning of this young adult. Like when you're in that sort of 25 age window, if you're establishing good routines then, it's going to be easy to keep those consistent. But if you wait until, if you think like, I'll deal with that when I'm 35 or 40 or whatever, for now I just want to have fun, then when you get to 35 or 40, it's going to be really difficult to like reverse all that. Yeah.
My mom raised us she was like the health nut, and we were from Portland, so we were like the Portland kind of hippies. But
right.
So my brother and my older sister, when they first moved out, they're like, oh my goodness, they ate all this junk, right? And
yeah.
They got out of the military, so got the
and
all this junk. And then eventually he's like, I'm just kind of sick. And then he like went back and he's like, yeah, I'm going vegan. And it's like, okay.
Yeah.
Full circle.
Yes, definitely. All right, so some of the cognitive changes that are taking place. You may notice, so we finished Piaget in adolescence, so there's not going to be any more of Piaget stages after, going forward. So one of the cognitive changes that's happening is that we tend to shift from sort of hypothetical thinking to more pragmatic thought. So last time we talked a little bit about how in adolescence we tend to be very idealistic, and we think about like what could be if X, Y, or Z. Whereas once we get into young adulthood, we start to realize like, yeah, all that's great to think about, but like we live in the real world where things are the way they are, and we kind of have to live within certain parameters. And so like, how can we optimize within those parameters? So thinking tends to become a lot more pragmatic and practical. Part of that is just due to experience with real world problems. So you go out into the world with all these ideals, and then you realize like, a lot of other people might have those same ideals, but there's all these obstacles and things in the way that make it almost impossible to achieve that. So like, let's just do the best that we can, basically. There also becomes this increase in what's called cognitive affective complexity. That's basically just the interaction between sort of our emotional ways of thinking and our more rational or logic ways of thinking. So we're able to kind of integrate those. So in adolescence, we might tend to think of like emotions and logic as being very separate. And as you get into adulthood, you might start to realize that, like, no, actually emotions are really integral to logical thinking and making good decisions. And so we become better at sort of using our emotions in a healthy, productive way. And part of that is also some of that executive function stuff we talked about before. So we're a lot better at regulating our emotions. We're better at articulating what those emotions are, where they come from, figuring out how to deal with those productively, etc. And then we also see increases in expertise and creativity. Again, expertise mostly because of that increased experience. We tend to start specializing a little bit during this age as well. So through adolescence, a lot of people are still like not necessarily very committed to a career path or to a skill set. They're kind of open to like lots of different ideas. Obviously, as you get into college and then, get into a career, you're sort of forced to pick something, right? And then you start to kind of specialize in that particular area. You develop expertise in that. It's also been shown that creativity tends to increase during this time, so more creative output. So those cognitive changes are happening oftentimes within the context of like an academic setting. So obviously not everyone is going to go to college. Around 65% of the population in the US will go to college, meaning they will at least like enroll in a semester of classes. That doesn't necessarily mean that all of them will finish it. In fact, I have the stat over there that about 42%. So that would be 42% of this chunk that went in. So 42% of this 65%. Will finish a degree within 4 years. So some might just take longer, but a lot of people tend to drop out, within those 4 years and not finish. So college can be obviously a very formative, important experience. In addition to all the obvious things, right? Like it's giving you formal education into whatever degree you're getting so that hopefully you can get a career in that field and be better at that career than you otherwise would be. But it also exposes you to a lot of new ideas, beliefs, to diversity, etc. A lot of us probably, I don't know how many of you move. Some people move around a lot, but a lot of us tend to grow up in kind of a bubble where it's like we live in one town for a really long time. We go to high school with all the same people for several years. Usually probably the people we're going to high school with are going to be very similar to us, like similar socioeconomic status, probably similar race. So we're not exposed to a lot of new ideas or new perspectives in high school. But then usually when you get into college, that's going to change. You're going to have people coming from all different places with different belief systems, etc. And so exposure to that can be very formative in developing during these young adulthood, this span that we're talking about. A lot of that, though, depends on how much you actually participate in campus life. I would say, obviously, during COVID, a lot of that would have declined, right? Because we were all sort of forced to be in our houses, our dorms, staring at a screen instead of interacting with other people. So, yes. Some of the factors that determine if someone will actually finish a degree, these are probably not surprising. One of them is how prepared they are for college to begin with, like how well their high school or their parents prepared them, what their motivations are. So people who are in college because they themselves are choosing to be there, like they have an intrinsic motivation that they want to pursue that, are much more likely to graduate compared to someone who's just going to college because like their parents tell them they have to, or because they just think like that's what you're supposed to do next, but they don't really have a plan or a goal. So having that more like internal drive or motivation is a pretty big predictor of graduating. Then obviously things like study skills, that's maybe part of preparation, but how good are you at studying? I know I had this experience where like for me, I went to a really crappy high school in Southwest Kansas. So high school was super easy for me. Like I skipped all the time and still got like straight A's, so never had to study or any of that. And then community college was kind of similar for me. Like it was fairly easy, didn't study very much, didn't really try. And then I finally went to university and like, my God, I think my first semester I had like a 2.0 GPA or something because I just didn't know how to study. I had never had to do it before. So I just didn't have those skills and then had to work very hard to develop them. So
Wait,
yeah.
how old were you when you transferred to university?
I would have been 20. I mean, I went from high school to community college for 2 years, and then, yeah.
Yeah, that's rough. It's a rough time.
Yes, yeah. And I also had a son who was like 1.5 at that time.
And
So,
you have a toddler.
yeah.
Wow.
Yes. But a lot of it was because I just hadn't, I did not study at all, didn't go to class, and yeah.
Oh no, it's the consequences.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, so having the skills. Another factor is how like emotionally attached you are to your parents and whether you are separated from them or not. So if someone has moved far away from home and they have a really strong emotional attachment to their parents, that can be very difficult. They may be homesick, and that may make them more likely to drop out. So all kinds of factors contribute to that, where only 42% of people who pursue a degree will actually finish it within 4 years. All right, so let's talk a little bit about career paths and how like career choices are made. This kind of ties into college, but not necessarily, right? Like a lot of people just go straight into a career after high school and maybe don't even go to college. Sorry, got a chunk of ice. Me awkwardly just chomp on it for a little bit. Some researchers classify our choosing of a career path into these 3 different stages. And these cover a pretty large age range, not just young adulthood. So the fantasy period would really start in like early to middle childhood. So that's where we maybe first start even learning about the fact that like eventually you're going to have a job and a career. And it's called the fantasy period because we're often just like fantasizing about what would be the funnest job, what would be the coolest job. That's the time where people are likely to say that like, I want to be an astronaut, or I want to be a firefighter, or I want to be a doctor, or like these really high aspirational type of jobs. The tentative period, that's around basically like beginning of adolescence, maybe like 11 to 16, like up until your maybe sophomore or junior year of high school. So that's where you start to really think about careers in a more complex way. You maybe start to think about like, what's the salary that I'm going to get from this job? How hard is it going to be? Do I need to get a degree? Like you're thinking through all the logistical things about what it would take to get that job. You might also be thinking a little bit about like, how does my skill set match with a particular job path? And then during the realistic period, that's where you're getting into like senior year of high school, college. That's where you're actually starting to pursue a job and commit to something, looking at actual job postings, maybe applying to jobs, obviously picking a major in a college if you go the college route. So it's kind of where you're like actually committing to a career path. Let's see. I should also say too, a lot of this stuff about career path is going to be updated pretty drastically, I think, over the next decade or so, because research shows that the way that, my generation and your generation like chooses careers is very different than how it's been done in the past. And that we also do not stick with careers anywhere near as long as previous generations. So most generations previous to us, they would like pick a career pretty much out of high school around that adolescent age and stick with that for their entire life. And there was a lot of benefit to that. They might, when they retire, they'd get like pensions and stuff that would pay their income basically for the rest of their life. But now we do not live in that kind of economy anymore, unfortunately. And I would say also too, in the past, it was pretty likely that if you stuck with a particular career, you were likely to get raises throughout that career. Whereas now, oftentimes the only way to actually get a raise is to move from one job to another, to basically like leverage, changing jobs in order to get a higher salary. And so people of my generation, your generation, are much more likely to switch jobs, but also to switch careers entirely. So not just to switch from one job to another within a career, but like to totally change career paths multiple times within their lifetime. So the way that we think about this career path now, like this fantasy period, tentative period, realistic period, or whatever, we're probably going to have multiple cycles of that throughout the lifetime. You might have to go back to get multiple degrees or to get certificates and things to try to update your education to get a new career. So there's this is very dynamic right now, I'd say, again, especially since COVID. Like COVID changed everything, including our economy and the way we pick jobs. So, let me see. Was there anything else I wanted to say about career paths? The last thing I'll say in the context of kind of academics and career paths, this sort of relates to that idea that I was saying that like you're more likely to be successful in college if you're intrinsically motivated by what you're doing. Part of that has to do with this idea of what's called flow. I don't know how many of you have ever heard of the concept of flow. It has other names probably that might be more well known, I don't know. But flow is kind of this state, this mental state that you get into when you're fully absorbed in a task. So, you know, some like athletes call it like being in the zone, or, you know, there's phrases like that that kind of mean the same thing. But it's this idea that you're doing something that's so engaging that often it will kind of like suspend your sense of time. So you might go into the task planning to only do it for like 30 minutes or something, and then suddenly realize like, oh my gosh, hours have passed and I've been working on whatever this task is. You also tend to kind of lose a sense of self, like you're so focused on whatever it is that you're doing that you're not really aware of yourself or your own thoughts or your own doubts or whatever. So it's just this full absorption in a task. So people who are able to get into this state for, you know, that's relevant to whatever their college major is or whatever their career path is, then they're much more likely to have like a high quality of life in regards to that career path. Like they're much more likely to enjoy it, to graduate, to be successful in that career path. There's actually some interesting brain changes that happen when someone is in a state of flow. I said cortex, that's so vague. There's hypofrontality. I guess hypofrontality refers to it. Basically, you have decreased activity in the prefrontal cortex, which may sound maybe a little counterintuitive compared to all the things we've talked about with executive function. But so if you think about it, part of what your prefrontal cortex is doing, like it's regulating yourself, but a lot of that involves kind of like self-judgment as well. So sometimes whenever we're engaged in a task and our prefrontal cortex is really active, then we're basically like judging ourselves. We're thinking like, oh, am I doing this well? Am I succeeding? Like, you know, just very doubtful. So when someone is in a state of flow, we see kind of the opposite, where like their prefrontal cortex sort of quiets for a little bit, so that you're not getting that self-judgment and self-doubt, and you're just focused entirely on the activity you're doing. So you're most likely to get into a state of flow if the activity you're doing is intrinsically rewarding. So that means it's something that you're pursuing because you want to do it, not because you're getting paid, not because someone else is telling you to, but because it's something that you actually enjoy. It's also more likely if you have a clear goal that you're trying to achieve, and if you have some sort of feedback that's like immediate. And also if it's a task that's challenging, but if you have the skill to meet that challenge, like you feel like you're competent and you can handle it. So I know a lot of you are like in a state right now where maybe you have no idea what you want to do for a career. You might be undecided for a major. Maybe you're just doing like the transfer associates or whatever. So if you're still trying to figure out what you want to do, I would say try to think about if you've ever been in this state of flow. And if you have, what triggered that? What got you into that state? And is there some way that you can turn that into a career path or pursue that as like a college major? Yeah.
Over the summer, I decided to take a whack at gardening, and I started to dig out the rocks in the garden.
Yeah.
And I know you're only supposed to just get it from the first couple of inches, but I ended up getting into a state of flow. And
Yeah.
I kept finding more and more and
Yes.
more rocks, and I dug a ridiculously deep and very big hole, and I need to get filtered now because I got an astronomical amount of rocks. But I was fixing up my dog enclosure because it's getting really muddy and it needs like more gravel and everything. But
Right.
my dogs keep digging literal dens in there.
Yeah.
The wolf dog is like creating a house there. And I was like, oh, I could just fill it with my rocks. So I finally broke down and bought a wheelbarrow, and it was really satisfying.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. That's awesome.
It was really hard, but I was like, I dug these rocks up.
Yeah.
I'm fixing my dog enclosure.
Yes. Yeah. I would say that relates to like the cognitive enrichment stuff that I was saying too. Like maybe it's not practical for you to find a job that fits this. Like just realistically, like, you know, maybe you're going to have to pick a job that just pays the bills. But if that's the case, then find hobbies like that make you feel this state of flow and try to like balance your life so you can do those. Yeah, Kira.
Maybe part of like that is part of why like it's so frustrating when like if you're in hyperfocus and someone interrupts you.
Oh.
Yes.
I feel like if you're drawn back to that state of where they kind of wake it up and then you're like, oh, and then you're like, I feel like all those things are pointed out. I think that's also why like when you have like autism or ADHD, I feel like sometimes you struggle with also tasks you're not good at.
Yeah.
It's just so frustrating. It's like, why can't you just work?
Yes. Yeah. Definitely.
It's hard to do it and stick to it when you're not getting like that reward response in your
So
brain.
I
Yes.
like the steering wheel cover on. It was so tight, and I got it on before. I had like 3 people helping me, and I could not get it on, and I got so mad. And I'm throwing it out my window and I dropped it. And I was like, I'm not doing that.
Yeah.
It's not worth getting upset over it too. You know?
Yeah.
So then I did get upset though, and I just started crying. I was like, no.
I think it's worth it sometimes to just throw things out the window.
It is.
Yeah.
Like, this is too frustrating for me.
Yeah.
It's not
It's just
worth
like
it to fight.
ditch it and
It's
move
gonna come
on.
out Like that, or it's gonna come out like at someone. I don't want that. So it's like always just pushing.
Yeah.
I would get mad when you're doing the dishes and the wheels won't go back on the track.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. My-
There's been times where I'm like pushing and I just go, like I throw it in, and my dad's like, bro, what the heck? I'm like, I'm done.
Yeah.
You do it.
My dog loves to like lick the dishes as I'm loading them.
Why do they do
But
that?
I know, and she's smart because she knows when I'm loading them and they're dirty, but she won't do it when I'm unloading them and they're clean. Like she knows. But yeah, but she'll do that and then she'll push the thing off the track, or she'll lick something so hard she like flicks it out of the little like utensil holder, and then it ends up like in the bottom where there's a heating element. I've had multiple times where something is melted in there because she like, I'm like, ugh. But it's cute when she licks it, so I let her keep doing it.
You know,